response. With us now, former assistant to the president for national security affairs, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Good to see you, sir. Let's just take the NBC News report on its face. Is this like the Japanese saying we're taking over the Philippines?
Well, I think it's a very direct threat, and the fact that there's no time frame attached to it shouldn't make us feel better, because it could be tomorrow, not 10 years from now. And I think this is something that the Biden administration just discounts. It doesn't perhaps believe it's possible, because part of their approach to China, really the main part for almost 3 years now, is simply to keep talking without any notion of how we're going to deter China from this kind of aggressive behavior. And it's of a piece with their failure to deter Russia before the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, their failure to deal with Iran and the current crisis in the Middle East. Everything is satisfied just by talking. So that's why they portray this conversation by the chairman of our Joint Chiefs with his Chinese counterpart as a step forward. Really, it's just regularizing something that occurs all the time anyway. The real question is, are we going to signal through that channel that before China thinks about going after Taiwan, they ought to think about what our response would be?
Yeah, I think about the mind control weapons, which sort of sounds something out of science fiction. The Chinese certainly have no problem experimenting on humans, the Uyghurs and others, in a way that the U.S. never could, to develop weapons that all of a sudden produce terrible cognitive results for soldiers and the like, directed energy, on and on and on. But the other part of this is what we are seeing the Chinese doing as well when it comes to their nuclear arsenal. The New York Times reporting China quietly rebuilds secretive base for nuclear tests. Imagery from the New York Times shows the remote desert in northern China 60 years ago is where China first tested and detonated a nuclear weapon, and the region is active once again. When we hear the idea from the Pentagon that we can celebrate this idea that we're now talking again, as if, to your point, talking is a means to an end, are we speaking a language yet that the Chinese understand? And what are we to make of all of these fairly provocative moves, whether it be about nuclear weapons or testing some really scary biological weapons that perhaps come relevant now after 3 years of a pandemic that started in China?
Well, on the nuclear side, the Chinese are thumbing their nose at us. We've said, and correctly, we said this in the Trump administration, we're not going to negotiate with the Russians about further limitations on our nuclear weapons in a bipolar context with Russia. If we're going to talk about limitations, China has to be included as they build up to the levels to which Russia and the United States have limited themselves. They're becoming a completely separate and distinct threat to the United States, separate from Russia. So we've said, fine, we'll talk to Russia if China's included, because if we're going to limit our weapons, China's going to limit theirs. And the Chinese have basically said, go take a hike. I mean, that's the kind of attitude that is not diminished. In fact, it feeds on this idea that, oh, it's so wonderful we're talking now, because it doesn't accomplish anything. And it's the nuclear threat, ultimately, that's the most serious. Before we even talk about arms control, we need a better nuclear strategy. We're not in a bipolar nuclear world anymore. We're increasingly in a tripolar nuclear world, both other countries being adversaries of the United States. We can deal with one, maybe at the levels we have now. We can't deal with both at those levels. And just quickly on the mind control thing, look, the Chinese communists have practiced this on their own people for 75 years. This is something I would not underestimate their capabilities in. And, you know, we're all familiar with the Havana syndrome problem, with which many in the government basically deny exists. I think most have believed the source of the problem has been Russia, possibly directed energy. But it's also entirely possible China is the source of Havana syndrome. So when you piece all that together, I do see this as serious. It's part of China's effort to find asymmetric ways to come after us. And I think we better be working on this both defensively and, frankly, offensively very hard.
Yeah. Speaking of asymmetric warfare, thousands of Chinese military-age men coming across our southern border would probably be added to the list. Mr. Ambassador, it's good to see you. Merry Christmas to you and yours, sir. Thank you.
Likewise, Merry Christmas.